Before we dive in, remember this history hides its darkest truths not in the shadows, but in the stories no one dares to repeat. Some empires rose on honor, others on conquest, and some on secrets so horrifying that even centuries later, they feel like fresh wounds on the pages of time. Tonight, we open one of those pages, a chapter the world tried to forget, where power, fear, and faith collided in ways more terrifying than legend. The rise of the Mamluk power machine did not begin with glory or thrones, but with chains. Each boy taken from distant lands, separated from everything he once knew, was reshaped inside a system designed to erase weakness and forge unwavering loyalty. They were not raised like ordinary soldiers. They were conditioned through fear, discipline, and relentless training that hardened their bodies and emptied their hearts of anything except obedience to the order that owned them. As they grew, survival became their instinct, submission became their language, and violence became the only tool they fully trusted. The Sultanate did not simply teach them how to fight, it taught them how to dominate, how to identify vulnerability, and how to maintain control over anyone who stood beneath their hierarchy. The transformation was so complete that, by adulthood, these once captured children moved like shadows of iron across the battlefield, feared not just for their skill, but for their cold precision, shaped entirely by a childhood devoid of softness. Their rise to power was built on a foundation of relentless brutality, political manipulation, and internal purges that ensured only the strongest remained, creating a ruling class forged by conflict rather than bloodline. Over time, they became more than soldiers. They became the architects of an empire that valued strength above morality, loyalty above mercy, and dominance above compassion. As this machine grew, it turned outward, looking for enemies, conquests, and resources to fuel its unending hunger for control, and every battle they fought reinforced the belief that power was the only truth worth serving, a truth they would enforce on anyone unfortunate enough to fall under their rule. When Christian territories weakened and border defenses crumbled, women were often the first to be caught in the tide of Mamluk expansion. Raids swept across frontier villages with ruthless efficiency, leaving behind ruins, smoke, and echoes of panic. Those who could flee escaped into forests or mountains, but many were trapped in the chaos of invasion, taken not as casualties of war, but as living assets of the victors. The Mamluks saw captives through a different lens than ordinary soldiers. To them, each prisoner represented value, leverage, and a means to demonstrate their dominance over rival faiths and collapsing empires. Christian women, especially, became highly sought after because of their symbolic importance in the ongoing struggle between cultures and religions. Once captured, they were marched away from their homes in chains or bound groups, forced on long journeys toward fortified cities where their identities, names, and past lives began to dissolve. The shock of displacement blended with fear as they realized they were entering a world entirely controlled by their captors, a world with rigid hierarchies and rules designed to break the spirit. They were separated from families, stripped of their freedom, and placed in environments where even their survival depended on the whims of men trained to suppress empathy. Their fate was never random. It was determined by age, appearance, status, and the needs of the Mamluk elites, who viewed them as both trophies of conquest and instruments of influence. Each woman's story became a silent struggle against a system built to erase her identity and repurpose her existence, a system that fed on the chaos of war and turned human suffering into a mechanism of power that strengthened the Mamluk world from within. The marketplace where these captives were taken operated in shadows even when it stood in plain sight, because everyone who participated understood the silence that surrounded it. It was not a simple bazaar, but a carefully controlled network where human lives were evaluated with the same detachment as rare goods. Christian women entered this world stripped not only of their freedom, but of any sense of stability, confronted with buyers who inspected them with cold calculation, searching for qualities that fit their private needs or political ambitions. The auctions were structured to maximize profit and to ensure that every captive was placed where she could serve a purpose, whether in wealthy households, elite barracks, or isolated estates where no one questioned what happened behind the gates. The hierarchy was brutal and precise. Some were ransomed back at high prices, some were kept for manual labor, and others were absorbed into intricate domestic roles that bound them permanently to their owners. Even the negotiation process was designed to intimidate, filled with coded language and subtle threats that reminded captives they no longer belonged to themselves. Behind every transaction was an unspoken rule that suffering should remain hidden, contained within walls that did not welcome witnesses. Families who tried to reclaim their loved ones were often trapped in impossible cycles of ransom demands, misinformation, and delays that drained their resources while offering little hope. For the women trapped in this system, every day became a quiet battle against erasure, a struggle to preserve fragments of identity while being treated as pieces of an economy driven by dominance and desperation. The marketplace did not simply sell people, it reshaped destinies, turning the trauma of war into a profitable industry that sustained the Mamluk order from its very core. Inside the elite households of the Mamluk world, life for Christian women shifted from public humiliation to private control, but the atmosphere remained suffocating. These homes were grand from the outside, filled with courtyards, marble floors, and guarded gates, yet every corner held the weight of absolute authority. Women brought into these spaces were observed constantly, their movements limited to specific rooms, corridors, or service areas that defined their new role in the hierarchy. Even the air they breathed felt regulated, shaped by the expectations of owners who viewed obedience as the greatest virtue. Conversations were monitored, friendships discouraged, and any sign of resistance met with swift correction. The household operated like a silent machine, where every servant, guard, and steward understood their place and reinforced it without question. Some women served in domestic duties, moving quietly through rooms filled with luxury they would never enjoy. Others were assigned to more personal roles, positioned closer to the family yet farther from their own sense of autonomy. The rules were unwritten but deeply understood. Do not speak unless spoken to. Do not question orders. Do not form attachments. Do not remember who you were before entering these walls. Isolation became a tool of control, cutting them off from familiar languages, customs, and beliefs so slowly that even their thoughts felt foreign over time. The emotional burden was just as heavy as the physical confinement, as each day blurred into the next, with no clear path to freedom. Even moments of calm carried an undercurrent of tension, because in these elite households, silence did not mean safety. It meant watching, waiting, and adapting. The women learned to read expressions, footsteps, and subtle shifts in mood to avoid punishment, navigating a world where power overshadowed compassion and where their existence became defined by the needs and whims of those who commanded the house. The Mamluks understood that maintaining power required more than physical control, it demanded domination of the mind, and they refined this into an art. Fear was their most effective instrument, woven into everyday life so seamlessly that it shaped the behavior of everyone under their authority. For Christian women trapped within their world, this fear took many forms, each designed to strip away any sense of resistance. It began with unpredictability, never knowing when a command would be given, when a rule would shift, or when silence would suddenly turn into accusation. This uncertainty kept captives alert, anxious, and compliant, constantly anticipating consequences they could not predict. Forced assimilation followed, slowly dissolving the identities these women carried from their homelands. They were encouraged and at times coerced to adopt new names, new languages, and new behaviors that aligned with the expectations of the household. The gradual loss of familiar customs and personal memories worked like a quiet erosion, wearing down the sense of self that once anchored them. Even gestures of apparent kindness were used strategically, creating confusion between gratitude and submission, making it difficult to distinguish benevolence from manipulation. Cultural erasure became another method, as the Mamluks understood that removing a captive's heritage made her easier to control. Religious symbols were restricted, traditional clothing replaced, and stories from their past dismissed or forbidden. Everything that once gave them strength, faith, family, community, was pushed farther away until it felt unreachable. Within this environment, domination was not loud or chaotic, it was systematic, layered, and intentional. Every rule reminded them that they were outsiders trying to survive in a world that offered no space for their identity. The rituals of power the Mamluks practiced were not just displays of authority, but mechanisms crafted to fracture the spirit and reshape it into something more manageable, ensuring that even silent defiance remained buried deep within their hearts. The histories of these women faded not because their suffering was insignificant, but because too many forces worked to bury their stories beneath layers of politics, pride, and fear. Chroniclers of the era wrote for rulers, not victims, and the Mamluks themselves had no interest in preserving accounts that exposed the darker machinery of their power. Official records emphasized victories, architectural achievements, and the glory of the Sultanate, leaving little room for the quiet tragedies occurring behind palace walls. Even when whispers of these events reached distant lands, they were often dismissed as exaggerations, propaganda, or tales crafted to fuel religious hostility, allowing the truth to dissolve into uncertainty. Families who lost daughters, sisters, or wives rarely had the means to preserve their voices. Many lived in border regions ravaged by conflict, where survival took precedence over documentation. Others kept silent out of fear, knowing that speaking too loudly about the Mamluk practices could invite retaliation or rekindle painful memories they were trying to escape. Over generations, these individual stories blurred and fragmented, surviving only in scattered letters, hidden notes, or oral traditions that lacked the authority of official histories. Religious sensitivities also played a role in erasing these accounts, as both Christian and Muslim societies often avoided discussing the complexities of captivity, assimilation, and cultural domination. The narrative was easier to simplify or ignore than confront in its full, unsettling reality. As time passed, scholars focused on political transitions, military campaigns, and economic systems, leaving the personal suffering of women overshadowed by grand historical themes. What remained were faint traces of a lived experience that once affected thousands, evidence scattered like broken pieces of a mosaic that historians struggle to reassemble. Yet beneath the silence lies a truth shaped by endurance, loss, and unspoken resilience, waiting for anyone willing to listen to the voices history abandoned